The room is quiet, but not peaceful. Cigarette smoke hangs low against the ceiling, curling around exposed wires and cracked wooden beams. A battered piano sits slightly out of tune, one key permanently stained darker than the rest. Guitar strings buzz softly on their own, stretched too tight, as if they're about to snap. On the floor, coffee cups overflow, untouched, cold for hours. No laughter, no harmony. Just 4 chairs pulled slightly too far apart. Outside, the world thinks this is the height of perfection. Inside, something is rotting, because what history calls the breakup wasn't a sudden ending. It was a slow fracture, one that split music, culture, and imagination into 2 separate timelines. And here's the uncomfortable thought no one likes to sit with. If they had stayed together, would music have reached its greatest evolution or collapsed under the weight of its own legends? There's no middle ground. By the time the final sessions rolled around, everyone in the room knew something was wrong. They just refused to say it out loud. The silence between notes was heavier than the music itself. What used to feel electric now felt tense, calculated. Every suggestion sounded like criticism. Every lyric felt personal. The Beatles weren't arguing the way bands usually do. There were no screaming matches, no dramatic walkouts at first. Instead, it was colder than that. Glances held a second too long. Songs arrived fully formed, leaving no room for collaboration. The magic that once lived in the gaps between ideas had started to disappear. Paul McCartney was pushing harder than ever, trying to keep the group focused, organized, productive. To some, it felt like leadership. To others, control. John Lennon, once the band's wild spark, seemed distant, half present, half already gone. His lyrics grew sharper, more confessional, less interested in pleasing anyone else in the room. Then there was George Harrison, quietly reaching a breaking point. He was writing more than ever, yet still treated like a secondary voice. Songs that could have reshaped the band were brushed aside, saving them for a future he didn't fully believe in yet. And Ringo Starr, the glue, could feel the rhythm slipping even if he didn't say it. What made that night different wasn't a single argument. It was the realization that no one was really listening anymore. They played through takes that felt technically fine but emotionally hollow. Jokes landed flat. Compliments sounded forced. The room that once birthed revolutions now felt like an obligation. At one point, the music stopped entirely, and no one rushed to fill the gap. That pause said more than any fight ever could. This is where the breakup became inevitable, not on paper, not in interviews, but in that shared understanding that the band no longer existed as one mind. It was 4 separate futures, all pulling in different directions, still wearing the same name. And yet, here's the twist most people miss. That same tension, the resentment, the rivalry, the quiet anger, was also pushing their creativity to extremes. Some of their boldest ideas came from this exact discomfort. The question wasn't whether they were falling apart. It was whether staying together a little longer would have created their greatest work, or destroyed them completely. And what happened next only made the divide impossible to ignore. The truth is, the band was never built on harmony alone. It was built on friction. From the beginning, the creative engine ran on a quiet war of ideas. Who could write faster, sharper, more unforgettable songs? But by the end, that rivalry stopped being playful and started cutting deep. At the center of it all sat 2 very different minds. John Lennon wrote like he was tearing pages out of his own head, raw, sarcastic, brutally honest. Paul McCartney chased structure and melody, polishing songs until they felt timeless. Early on, those differences balanced each other. Later, they became weapons. Songs turned into conversations no one had out loud. A lyric about independence wasn't just poetry, it was a message. A perfectly crafted chorus wasn't just catchy, it was proof. Each new track felt like a quiet challenge, asking the same question. Who is really carrying this band now? And it wasn't just about ego, it was about control. Who decided what sounded right? Who led? The studio? Who got the final word? What once felt like creative push and pull hardened into territorial lines. Instead of finishing each other's ideas, they started finishing around each other. Meanwhile, George Harrison was evolving fast, faster than anyone expected. He wasn't just the quiet one anymore. He was bringing in deeper themes, unfamiliar sounds, and songs that demanded space. But space was the one thing the band no longer had. His growth didn't fit neatly into a system built for two leaders, and resentment quietly piled up. Even Ringo Starr felt the shift. When the rhythm section senses instability, it's already too late. Sessions became transactional. Play the part, finish the take, move on. Here's the uncomfortable part. That rivalry didn't just weaken the band, it sharpened it. Pressure forced risks. Competition drove ambition. Some of their most daring ideas came from trying to outdo one another, not please each other. So imagine this rivalry never boiling over. Imagine it redirected instead of resisted. Could that creative tension have fueled another decade of evolution? Or would the constant comparison have turned the band into a battlefield with no survivors? Because once rivalry replaces trust, the collapse isn't loud, it's inevitable. And the business side of the band was about to make everything worse. When Brian Epstein was alive, chaos had a ceiling. Arguments still happened, egos still clashed, but there was always a final voice in the room, someone who could pull the emergency brake before things went too far. When he was gone, that voice vanished overnight. Epstein wasn't just a manager, he was a buffer. He handled decisions no one else wanted to touch, smoothed over bruised egos, and kept the business side far away from the music. After his sudden passing in 1967, that protection disappeared, and the band walked straight into a vacuum. At first they told themselves they could handle it. They were the biggest act on the planet. How hard could it be? That confidence didn't last long. Meetings dragged on for hours. Decisions went unresolved. Every choice felt personal because there was no neutral referee left to absorb the blame. Apple Corps was supposed to be freedom. Instead, it became confusion. Money flowed out faster than anyone could track. Friends of friends showed up with ideas. Projects were approved without plans. And with no clear leadership, every disagreement reopened old wounds. Business arguments spilled into creative sessions, poisoning what little trust remained. This is where things turned quietly ugly. Aligning with the wrong advisor wasn't just a financial decision, it became a declaration of loyalty. Choosing sides off stage meant taking sides on stage. The band didn't split in half all at once. It fractured into alliances. Some fans still swear the atmosphere felt cursed after Epstein's death. Strange coincidences, bad timing, a run of decisions that all seemed to go wrong at once. The grounded explanation is simpler. 4 artists, drowning in responsibility, suddenly forced to manage an empire they never asked for. But the outcome was the same either way. Without a central guide, the band started negotiating against itself. Momentum stalled. Patience evaporated. And once the music had to compete with contracts, lawsuits, and control, it lost every time. The tragedy isn't that the band argued more after Epstein, it's that no one knew how to stop it. And just as the foundation cracked beyond repair, the scale of what they were risking became impossible to ignore. To understand how fragile this moment really was, you have to zoom out and look at the numbers, because nothing about this band operated at a human scale. The Beatles sold over 600 million records worldwide, a figure so large it still hasn't been cleanly matched decades later. In just 8 active years, they landed 20 Billboard #1 hits, a record that reshaped how success itself was measured. By 1966, they were earning the modern equivalent of over $50 million per year, while touring had already stopped completely. Their catalog has generated more than $1 billion in long-term revenue, even without new releases. And here's the strangest part. Each member was capable of filling stadiums alone. 4 individuals, 1 brand, cultural gravity on a planetary level. That kind of scale doesn't just amplify success, it amplifies pressure. Every disagreement mattered. Every delay echoed globally. When they hesitated, the entire industry stalled with them. Radio formats bent, fashion shifted. Other artists waited to see what direction they'd move next. Some fans claim this level of influence borders on the supernatural, like the band was tuned into something larger than themselves. The grounded explanation is simpler. Timing, talent, and total cultural saturation colliding at once. Still, when numbers get this big, reality starts to feel unreal. And that raises the most dangerous question of all. What happens when something this massive refuses to stop growing? Picture the timeline splitting quietly in 1970. No press conference, no official statement, just another album announced like nothing was wrong. Because if the band hadn't broken up, the most fascinating part of their story wouldn't be what they were, it would be what they were about to become. The early 70s were a musical earthquake. Funk was tightening its grip. Synths were creeping into pop. Progressive rock was stretching songs past the 10-minute mark. And somehow, the Beatles were positioned to absorb all of it. Not by chasing trends, but by bending them. You can hear the blueprint in what already existed. Songs pulling toward raw confession, others leaning into orchestration, tape loops, early electronics. Each member was already exploring different futures, just separately. If they had stayed together, those futures would have collided in the same room. Imagine an album where sharp minimalist tracks sit next to sprawling spiritual pieces, funk-driven bass lines underneath introspective lyrics, early synthesizers layered with analog warmth. Not a nostalgic band repeating old formulas, but a restless group redefining what a rock album even meant in the 70s. But here's the catch. Someone would have had to compromise. Who leads the sound? Whose vision gets trimmed? The band thrived on contrast, but contrast turns volatile when there's no shared destination. The very thing that made those hypothetical albums thrilling could have made them impossible to finish. Some fans claim these albums already exist in fragments, that you can stitch them together from solo records, demos, unreleased takes. The grounded explanation is less mystical. Those songs with a future just scattered across 4 separate paths instead of 1. Still, it's hard not to wonder. Would the next decade have given us the most daring music ever recorded, or a legendary band slowly diluting its own myth? Because once imagination starts filling in the gaps, reality can never quite measure up. And that's where the rumors begin. When something ends too abruptly, the mind refuses to accept it. That's where the rumors crept in, whispers that the band never truly stopped, that somewhere, behind locked doors and unmarked tapes, they were still creating together, just out of sight. The most infamous claim, of course, is the idea that Paul had been replaced years earlier, and everything after was an elaborate illusion. Fans pointed to altered vocals, strange reflections, and lyrics that felt like confessions hidden in plain sight. Some even swore they could hear extra voices buried deep in the mixes, ghostly harmonies that weren't listed anywhere. The grounded explanation is far less eerie. Analog recording was messy. Tape bleed, vocal layering, and audio pareidolia can make the brain hear patterns that aren't intentionally there. When people desperately want meaning, sound becomes a canvas. Still, the rumors didn't stop there. Stories surfaced about secret studio meetups in the 70s, uncredited backing, vocals, familiar chord progressions appearing in solo albums at the same time. Fans lined up timelines and insisted the math couldn't be coincidence. Again, the rational answer is simple. Shared history shapes instinct. When artists grow together, they carry each other's fingerprints forever. Similar ideas don't require secret meetings, just memory. But here's what keeps the verdict open. These myths didn't appear randomly. They surged whenever the world felt unstable, whenever fans needed reassurance that something pure hadn't vanished forever. The band became less a group and more a presence, something people felt even when it wasn't physically there. So, whether these echoes were paranormal, psychological, or purely emotional almost doesn't matter, because belief kept the band alive long after the music stopped. And belief, when shared by millions, has consequences far bigger than truth, which is exactly why their absence reshaped everything that came next. When the band disappeared, it created a vacuum, and vacuums don't stay empty for long. Entire movements rushed in to fill the silence, reshaping music in ways no single artist ever could. But here's the uncomfortable question. What if that silence never happened? If the Beatles had stayed together, rebellion itself might have looked different. Punk thrived on tearing down giants. Disco bloomed in the space where rock loosened its grip. Even early hip-hop grew in a world where no single band dominated the cultural conversation. A never-ending Beatles era would have bent that trajectory, or blocked it entirely. Some argue that their continued presence would have smothered innovation, freezing the industry in a permanent state of comparison. Why take risks when the biggest act alive keeps redefining the standard? Labels might have played it safer. Radio might have leaned harder on what already worked. The future could have arrived slower. But there's another side to that coin. Their evolution forced everyone else to evolve faster. Each reinvention reset the rules. If they'd pushed into synths, global sounds, or minimalism earlier than anyone else, entire genres might have accelerated instead of stalled. The band didn't just follow culture, they dragged it forward. There's even a near-mythic claim that their breakup freed music, as if something invisible lifted overnight. The grounded explanation is timing. Social unrest, new technology, and generational shifts were already in motion. The band didn't cause the change. They simply stopped anchoring it. Still, it's hard to ignore how quickly the world scattered once they were gone. Without a single cultural center, everything fragmented. Scenes replaced movements. Icons replaced collectives. Music became louder, stranger, more confrontational. So was their breakup a necessary release, or the moment culture lost its last shared heartbeat? Because once unity disappears, it rarely comes back the same way. And the cost of that loss wasn't just cultural, it was deeply personal. Legend has a way of flattening people into symbols. But behind the theories, the numbers, and the cultural impact, there were 4 exhausted humans quietly running out of space to breathe. Staying together wouldn't just have been an artistic decision. It would have been a psychological one. Creative pressure doesn't fade when success peaks. It multiplies. Every release carries expectation. Every lyric gets dissected. And when the world refuses to let a band evolve privately, growth starts to feel like betrayal. For some, that kind of weight becomes unbearable. John Lennon was drifting toward raw self-exposure, less interested in being an icon than a person. Being locked inside the band's myth would have meant suppressing that instinct or detonating it publicly. George Harrison, already pulling toward spirituality and independence, might have felt permanently overshadowed, no matter how strong his voice became. Even success has diminishing returns. When applause becomes background noise, motivation erodes, resentment replaces gratitude. What once felt like purpose starts feeling like obligation. Some fans claim that staying together could have prevented later personal spirals. The grounded explanation cuts deeper. No amount of unity can replace personal agency. And then there's the quiet damage. Burnout doesn't announce itself. It shows up as distance, numbness, disinterest. Artists stop fighting because they've already checked out. A band can technically exist long after it's emotionally gone. This is the part most alternate histories avoid, because imagining endless brilliance is easier than imagining the slow erosion of trust, joy, and identity. Staying together might have produced more music, but at what cost to the people making it? Sometimes breaking apart isn't failure, it's survival. And that realization reframes everything we think we lost. When people ask what the world lost when the band split, they usually mean albums, tours, moments that never happened. But the real loss, or gain, runs much deeper than unreleased music. It lives in the version of culture we never got to experience. If the Beatles had stayed together, history might have given us fewer legends, but one unshakable center, a single creative force evolving in real time, carrying the weight of an entire generation's imagination. Music could have felt more unified, more guided, or more restricted, because the same unity that creates clarity can also kill rebellion. Without the breakup, maybe punk doesn't roar as loudly. Maybe experimentation slows. Maybe culture waits instead of reacts. Or maybe the band becomes the first true shapeshifter of modern music, refusing to be pinned to any era at all. What's undeniable is this: the breakup didn't end their influence. It redistributed it. 4 separate paths created 4 different echoes, touching genres, movements, and artists that might never have existed otherwise. Fragmentation became fuel. The haunting part isn't choosing which timeline was better. It's realizing both required sacrifice. Either they stayed together and risked hollowing themselves out for the sake of the world, or they walked away and forced the world to grow without them. So the question isn't what if they never broke up. It's whether greatness is meant to last forever, or burn bright enough to change everything, then disappear. And once you see it that way, the ending stops feeling tragic. It feels inevitable.